Is 3.8 centimeters the perfect size? Well, Audemars Piguet have just released their iconic Royal Oak perpetual calendar in 38 millimeters, down from their 41 millimeters, and I'm thrilled. I've been talking about the transition in the watch industry from larger, 44 millimeter watches down to the 36, 38 millimeter, more wearable watches. And to see one of the industry's biggest and most recognizable brands, Audemars Piguet, doing this, it's a perfect example of the industry starting to shift to these smaller watches. Like all trends, watches work in a cyclical nature, and we often see these bigger watches and then back to a smaller watch. And we've been in an era of large, 44 millimeter watches and sports and dive watches. And we're starting to see that shift to smaller and smaller, more wearable watches. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the trend was smaller, dressier watches. And after the quartz crisis into the 90s and the 2000s, the trend really became steel sports watches. And just due to their nature, steel sports watches are inherently larger. And as we moved from the 2000s into the 2020s, we started to see these case sizes slowly increase from 40 to 41 to 42 millimeters and even 44 millimeters, and sometimes even larger than that. And it got to a point where people sort of assumed that anything under 40 millimeters was of lesser value and not as desirable, as if 40 millimeters was some indicator of value. But on the flip side, if you're like me and you like that 36 to 38 millimeter diameter, then this has been a great time to get harder to find allocations of watches in that size because they haven't been as desirable and they're a little bit easier to get. And this trend of increased diameter in watches is also seen in the women's trend. If we go back to the 60s and 70s, we saw popularity in that 24 to 30 millimeter range. And over time, it's crept up to that sort of 28 to 34 millimeter range. It even got to a point where the people who were into, a 44 millimeter watch were sort of considering 36 millimeter as a women's size or an in-between size, which is crazy to me. Now, back to the Royal Oak, a true icon in the watch world, and it's designed by one of the most legendary designers of all time, Gerald Genta. When it was first released at the Basel Watch Fair in 1972, the original dimensions were 39 millimeters in diameter and 7 millimeters in thickness. And at the time, this was considered a fairly large watch. Now, over time, we've seen many variations of the Royal Oak get released, from the perpetual calendar to the chronograph and even the offshore. And the sizes on these have continued to go up, from 41 to even 44 millimeters for some of the variations. And this is what consumers wanted at the time. These big chunky watches were the trend, and it seemed that with watches it really was the bigger the better. Now, all wrists are obviously quite different, and for some people 44 millimeters might be the perfect fit. But I've been preaching for years to whoever will listen that the sweet spot for most men's wrists is that 36 to 38 millimeter diameter, and maybe even 40 millimeter depending on your wrist. But for the most part, these smaller diameters will look better on your wrist. And I actually wear a 26 millimeter vintage Tag Heuer quite often. I used to wear it all the time, and it really helped me get used to that smaller watch size and just how comfortable it actually feels. And diameter is only part of the equation. We also have to consider the lug-to-lug distance, which is quite literally the distance from the bottom lug all the way up to the top lug. And this has a big impact on how far the watch actually stretches on your wrist and how comfortable it sits over the curvature of your wrist. A large lug-to-lug distance can make a smaller watch diameter look quite large, as it doesn't sit right on your wrist. And vice versa, a smaller lug-to-lug distance on a larger diameter watch can help it feel a little bit smaller. And the other part of the equation is the thickness, which has more to do with how the watch actually wears than how it looks, but it still does play an important part. A thinner watch will likely sit closer to your wrist, it'll be a bit more comfortable, and it will make the watch stand out less. Whereas a thicker watch will sit further from your wrist and it will really accentuate the size of the watch. But brands have had to be pretty careful about how they manage this, as most men don't want to be told that their wrist is actually too small for that watch and they should look for something smaller. But personally, I think that most men do need to look for watches that are a little bit smaller than what they think. But it's not very often that your AD will tell you that your wrist is too small for that watch, because they obviously don't want to offend you. Earlier this year, we saw AP release the mini frosted quartz Royal Oak coming in at 23 millimeters, and people went crazy for them. This was 11 millimeters smaller than their previous smallest Royal Oak offering. 11 millimeters in the watch world is a massive step. And I do think that this was a bit of a litmus test for AP to release a drastically smaller watch in maybe a bit of a less desirable quartz Royal Oak. And I think that this is also an indication of where their production is going. And I do think this was a bit of a litmus test for Audemars Piguet to see how consumers reacted to this. By playing with the size of one of their less popular versions, the Quartz Royal Oak, they were able to get a really good understanding of what their consumers wanted to see. And I think that this will help shape the future development of their watches. Now, AP would have already had these 38mm perpetual calendars in production, as it takes years to produce and design these watches. So this 23mm Quartz Royal Oak didn't decide these 38mm perpetual calendars, but I think in unison with the 38mm, it's going to help guide and shape the next releases for Audemars Piguet. And not only did AP release the Royal Oak perpetual calendar in 38mm, they also released the Code 1159 perpetual calendar in 38mm. AP is doubling down on this smaller size of their most popular watch models. To me, this is the perfect indicator that the pendulum has started to swing back to that 36 to 38mm sweet spot for watches. And whether you like big watches or not, there's no denying that the trend of consumers and brands is starting to trend to these smaller, more wearable watches. And I'm looking forward to seeing what other iconic brands start to slim down their models a little bit. I would love to see a Rolex Diver, for example, in a 38mm. That would be perfect. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.